Today we're talking about channel processing on the Midas MR18 and Behringer XR-18 style digital mixers. They're very similar, so there's a lot of crossover. If you don't have this particular one, you're still in luck. And if you have the 12-channel version, yes, it's all very similar as well. So this should play out just fine for you so that you can follow along for your particular console. If you didn't watch the setup video, go ahead and check that out. I'll put a link to it and all the rest of the videos in this playlist down in the description below. When we're on our main screen, we can touch anywhere in the channel path or the part above where the name is to get to the different parameters that we want to for processing on that particular channel. So that's how we select the channel, and we can go straight to the parameter that we want, but we'll also be given tabs to navigate over there. So if I hit up here at the very top, it's going to take me to the input tab. This is where we control the mic preamp, or if we want to have our input coming from USB, we can connect to a computer and this becomes an audio interface. We can play back channels from that. And we've got our control over our mic gain, USB trim so we can turn up or down the signal coming back from USB, and our high pass filter. A high pass filter is really helpful for getting rid of unwanted low frequencies and a very quick way to clean up your mix. If you just figure out how to get the gain right, how to get the high pass filter right, and get your channel faders in the right spot, you're going to have a good sounding mix in a hurry without a whole lot of fuss. In the setup video, we talked about 48 volts for phantom power, and we looked at linking two channels. So like on our overheads, if I select the overhead channels, you can see that that's linked. We can link an odd even pair. One other that I'm going to do here, we can see we've got keys left and keys right. I don't want to have to duplicate all the processing that I'm doing on one and then copy it over to the other. That's kind of a pain. So instead, I'm going to hit link, and it asks me, do I want to link channels 9 and 10? I hit yes, and now those function together, not independently. There's also the polarity flip switch, which is helpful if you've got two microphones on a single input and they might be combining in a way that makes the low end go away. You can flip that polarity switch on one of those, let's say on our snare drum in the overheads make the snare drum sound thinner. We flip the polarity on the snare, and now suddenly the overheads make the snare drum sound thicker. That's what we want, and I've covered that in other videos on mixing. The next tab that we have is the Sends tab, and I'm actually going to pause this one and wait till the end to talk to you about it, because some of the stuff over here for where we send stuff or where in the channel path we send it, you want to understand what those things are, so we're going to skip over this and come back to it toward the end. The first processor that does stuff other than the high pass filter and the gain is the gate. The gate allows us to turn down the signal when the signal that we want is below a certain point. This makes it so that any unwanted noise, we turn that down automatically. Now, I'm not a huge fan of gates. I think they can be a little bit distracting and they can take out some of the dynamic range that you want. Let's say some little detaily stuff might get pushed down. So I don't often reach for a gate, but this is how you would use it. The power button, or turning it on in the circuit, is over here on the top left, and we've got different types of gates and expanders that we can use for each of these channels. Now, if you watch the setup video, this was turned up on its side. Now I've got a bunch of mic inputs plugged into it, so I can play back for you some tracks from my band in a box. If I hit play on this, and let's look at the electric guitar, we'll turn this up, turn all these, those aren't doing anything. We'll just have the electric guitar up, and let me pop open the headphones so that I can hear it and you can hear it too. If I had the gate on, I could turn up the threshold. So with the gate on and the threshold way up, the signal hasn't exceeded the threshold, so it's not opening it up. It's turning it down by the range that we have over here on the right side. So if I turn that range up, now I'm only turning it down 23 dB while it's below the threshold. Now if I lower my threshold, now it popped up in level a whole lot. But as the notes trail off, you can hear that the gate closes back down and pushes the signal down some more. This is not necessarily what we'd want in a mix, but it helps demonstrate the concepts on an instrument. You can hear how the trail ends of a note get cut off. If that was just background noise, that would be helpful. Now over here on the right side, we have the timing controls for our gate. The attack time is how quickly it will open up after the signal goes up above the threshold, or how much it's going to snap from the full range down to all the way up and open. The hold and release are how long it's going to hold on and stay open after the signal goes back down below the threshold, and then the release is how quickly or slowly it turns it back down again. There's also a filter and a key, but that goes beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, and I very rarely use those. So if you want to dive deeper, there's a video that I'll link to down in the description below. Expanders, say 2, 3, and 4, they use a little bit gentler way to turn it down. So instead of it suddenly coming back up after it gets above a certain point, it kind of ramps up as the input signal comes up. Can gates be helpful? Absolutely, but it's not the first thing that I would work on. Now let's move on to the dynamics section. The dynamics section could be a comp or an expander, which an expander is what we had over here on the gate section if we chose expand 2 or 3, but for the dynamics, we're typically going to want a compression segment. Now, when you load up your console for the first time, you might just see one knob on here. I've got the advanced controls turned on. If you only see this, you can look at this top button over here to get more robust controls. Without the advanced controls, all we have is the threshold control. So if I play this same electric guitar part for you, listen to it again. Turn off that gate. I can turn down the threshold, and the more that the signal goes up in level, the more the compressor will turn down the signal. It's diminishing the dynamic range. You can see here that GR lights are lighting up more toward the left as the guitar plays louder. As we raise the threshold up, the guitar gets louder because we're turning it down less. Again, it also has a power button over here. You probably don't want to hit that on and off in the middle of a performance, probably just during sound check. With the advanced controls, we've got a whole lot more going on here. Here we have the same threshold. This is the same as that knob that we had in the simple controls. This says where in the dynamic range we want to start applying the ratio. The ratio is a mathematical form of how many more outputs are going to let out, 1, to how many more inputs come in above the threshold. Right now it's set at 3. We could set it at 4 or however many more we want, all the way up to 100. That would mean that it would take 100 dB of increased input to get 1 more dB of increased output. Not typically what we want for a musical performance, so typically I'll set this around 3 or 4. The knee control on this slider down at the bottom allows us to choose how gently we go from no compression below the threshold to our full ratio above the threshold. So with a hard knee, it's going to be a sudden change. With a soft knee, it's a little bit gentler and we get a milder ratio near the threshold. All the way up to above the threshold, we get our full ratio. There's also the wet-dry mix, so if we wanted to mix in some of the uncompressed signal with the compressed signal, we could do that. But on these consoles, I don't typically do that. If I want to do parallel compression, that's usually something I'm doing when I have multiple channels because I want a little bit more control on that. But just know that if you have this on dry, it's not going to hear any changes that you're making with compression, even if it's on with the power button over here. You want to make sure that that stays wet all the way. Now, because we're turning down the signal with compression, sometimes when we have this, it's going to make the overall signal quieter, and maybe too quiet so that we have to push up the fader and then we run out of control. So instead of doing that, after you pull down the threshold to get the amount of compression that you want, you can use the gain over here to boost the signal after the compressor. Now, if we went and boosted the signal before the compressor at our input stage with our mic gain, then we would just get more into compression. We would get, we would have to take 3 more dB of input gain to only get 1 more dB of output gain. That's not what we want. We want to turn up the whole thing after we've turned down the dynamic range with our compressor. That's what the gain is for there. So start with it at 0. Then after you lower your threshold and get a good amount of dynamic range control, then you can boost that up and make sure that your fader is still in a good spot. The attack and the release times are similar to what it does with the gate, but the attack time is how quickly it responds to increased input. So if we want to let more transients through, we would slow down our attack time. If we want to control more of those quicker sounds of transients like pick click on an acoustic guitar or the snap on a snare drum, we would make that attack time faster. The hold, I never really mess with. I've not seen another style of console outside of the Behringer Midas universe have a hold time on a compressor, but if you want to play around with that, you can. More often, I'm adjusting the release time. But for the most part, if you don't know what you're doing and you're just trying to figure out what compression does, you can just turn it on auto mode and play around with the threshold, ratio, and makeup gate. But for the most part, if you don't know what you're doing with attack and release time, for most inputs, not drums really, but most inputs are going to be fine in auto mode. If you're just trying to get some dynamic range control, turn that on and you should be good to go. One other thing to look on here is the peak versus RMS. Peak measures the absolute peak signals, where RMS is more paying attention to the average levels. So you can get a little bit more smooth compression perhaps with RMS mode, and you can get a little bit more aggressive or be a little bit more particular in the fine tuning of absolute peaks in peak mode. Either one of those are fine, but you have to know what you're trying to do with that. So experiment with it and see how it sounds different on your inputs. Next up is the EQ section, and honestly, the EQ section on this is fantastic. The ability to find a frequency and move it around with your finger and then make it wider or narrower with just pinching or spreading. I don't know what the opposite of pinching is, but whatever you do when you push your fingers in and spread it apart to make the bandwidth wider, that's really, really helpful. It can get you results very quickly if you know what you're aiming for, but it can also get you in trouble. Say if you drag your finger up here and now suddenly that frequency starts feeding back, that's not a good thing. So although it's powerful, you have to be careful with what you're doing there. Over on the right side, you've got your parametric controls, or you've got the frequency that you can choose by turning this knob up and down. You've got the gain on how much you're turning it up or down, and you can use the knob for the width here, but you can't see if the gain is down all the way. So you've got the width control here as well. Those are all really handy, and you can turn on the real-time analyzer or the RTA so that you can see the balance of frequencies of what's going on with your input. So if something starts to feed back and there's some one frequency that's ringing, you can see that on the screen, put your EQ there, make it really narrow, and hopefully that feedback frequency now goes away. The power button for the EQ is over here in the bottom right, and it's on by default, which I think is a very good thing. There are a couple other things to look at on the EQ though. The first is the type of EQ curve that we have. For these middle two, typically you're going to leave it in PEQ or VEQ. The only real difference is the general width that they're using. I typically stay in PEQ for these boards, but for the top and bottom band, there's a couple other shapes that you might want to try out. On the bottom band, I like the low shelf. It looks kind of like a barbecue fork, and that allows me to turn up or down all the frequencies at that point and below by the same amount. It works in both directions, and on the high band, it's already set up to high shelf by default, and so you could make things just darker overall or brighter overall with one thing. Now you can see there's a little bit of background noise you can see showing up on the RTA. When I boost up that signal, we're boosting up more noise coming from the mic input. The other two shapes that you'll want to see here are the high pass filter and low pass filter. If you remember from our setup video over on the input, we've got the high pass filter over here where we can turn it on and turn up our high pass filter frequency. Unfortunately, this doesn't show up on our EQ page. It doesn't say what's actually going on there and what we might be already cutting out of our signal when we're looking here. It'll still show up on the RTA, right? So the low frequencies that might be missing could be a result of our high pass filter being on and too high, but we can see what the high pass filter looks like over here on the EQ page. If we go to our low band and then this little symbol here is for the low pass or high pass filter. You can see here that it's dumping off low frequencies and it's dumping off more low frequencies farther the farther down we go. So if we roll this up, then we're getting less and less low frequencies, and they're keeping on going down and down and down. This is very helpful for inputs that might have plosives or some wind noise, and really anything else that has low frequencies that you don't want rumbling through. One trick to getting a lot of big low end is to only have the stuff stuff producing low end that needs to produce low end. That's why I often say at the end of my videos, it's all about the low end. When you get that right, everything else falls into place. So the high pass filter is very, very helpful. And this could help you visualize what might be going on with your high pass filter that's over here on the input page. Just like we have a high pass filter, on the high band, there's also a low pass filter. And really, any of these can be any shape, which is kind of handy. Although it could be a little bit confusing. I don't know why your highest band you would want to be a high pass filter, but to each his own. We can put a low pass filter on here and cut out unwanted high frequencies. Let me cue up the bass and see if we can hear what's going on with a low pass filter on that, because the bass doesn't have a whole lot of high frequencies that we need unless somebody is playing slap, and even then you can tame it down a little bit. Let's take a listen on the bass. What an inspiring bass part. I know, sometimes bass players just have to take one for the team. But those few times when you would hit the fret clang a little bit, we want to take that out, and then it's less distracting, and it leaves more room for other things to shine in those higher frequencies. The next tab we have are the inserts. But before we go on to that, I want to thank our friends over at Zounds for lending me this little mixer so that I could show you this stuff. I'm a Zounds affiliate, and when you purchase stuff through them, through my affiliate links, it generates a small commission to me, and it helps support the channel. So if you've got some little bits and pieces of gear to buy, buying it through Zounds after clicking through the link in the description below really helps me out, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate them for letting me demo gear so that I can show you. All right, back to the inserts. In our effects rack, which we'll talk about after we circle back to the sends, we've got different processors that we could use as inserts here on the channel. So an insert is a processor that the entire channel goes through and then comes back before the fader. We could have this insert so that we could choose different ones of these effects parameters, and maybe we wanted to put a chorus on just the acoustic guitar. We could insert that right here. Although this song doesn't have an acoustic guitar, we could still try that. We could do it on the bass if we wanted, but we're not going to today. So an insert puts that processor through there, and the entire processor, or the entire signal, goes through that processor before returning just before the channel fader. For reverbs and things, I don't usually do that, and we've got effects sends, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But that's what an insert is. You can use it, but it's not always what I will go to. I guess the one that I might use is a de-esser on some vocalist. If the S's and T's are a little bit bright, I can use that to tame the S's by themselves dynamically, and that's one place where I might use the insert here on this board. To actually insert it, you actually have to press this button here to make it blue, but as this goes, right now the effect would be going through a reverb and probably at 100% wet. Probably wouldn't sound that great, so we're going to turn that off for now. The next tab we have are for presets, and I don't generally recommend presets because often with novice mixers, there's something that goes off in your mind of, well, I recalled the preset, so I don't need to adjust anything anymore. This is kind of a problem, although there is some utility in having it as a starting place. So you can have a starting place for different singers. If you've got singers swapping out on the same microphone, that can be helpful for the way that you mix so that you don't have to adjust every different parameter back and forth and just recall their preset. But even if you had a great preset before, your mix right now or your input right now might not sound the same on the input as it did before. So always still use your ears if you save a preset and recall it. Okay, my rant is over now. That's how you can make a preset. You can make a new one by hitting the page with a plus there. You can edit it with a little pencil. After you select one, you can load it, predefine run. I don't know. I'm not huge into presets, so I don't bother with it too much. If you want to, go for it. Now on the output page, this is where we can pan stuff left and right. We can unassign it from the main bus. It's by default assigned to the LR bus, or that main output that's going to come to the outside of our console. And we can assign it to DCA groups or mute groups. And we've got the auto mixer over here, which you probably should ignore unless you're doing talking head stuff a lot, like a bunch of different people on stage talking and going back and forth and near interrupting each other. I've heard it doesn't work that great. I haven't played around with it all that much, but I probably wouldn't use this. So just ignore the auto mix. You don't have to use it. Ride the faders if you need to. So that's all of the channel processing except for the sends. So for the sends, there's kind of two different sections here that we can go over. We can select an individual channel and see where it's sent to different buses. So these could be different monitor mixes, and then we've got our 4 effects sends as well. There's an option as well that this is something that can trip you up. So if you've dozed off a little bit, or if you're looking at your other device instead of this video, come back. You need to pay attention to this part. The faders here at the bottom section are reflecting what's being sent to whatever is selected over here on the right side. So right now it's lit up blue for main, and this fader right here is the master fader for our main output. But if we selected a different output on, say, bus 1, this is now the master for bus 1, and our faders are reflecting what's going on here going to bus 1. So all of these are now reflected what's on bus 1. So let's say suddenly you've been affecting or messing with bus 1 because somebody's monitor mix is on bus 1 and they wanted some changes. And then you set your iPad down, you got a drink of coffee, you came back and you're like, oh, I can't hear the lead vocal right now. I need to turn that up. And you turn up the lead vocal or keys vox. Now you've only turned it up in bus 1. You haven't turned it up in the main. So you would need to go back to the main over here. And that's just one thing to double check to make sure that you're on the right layer or selected the right output. So this right side becomes very, very important. You don't want to mess that up. It's happened to the best of us. I'm not the best of us, but it's happened to me too. So make sure that you're on the right layer. You can get to sends either by selecting this and turning up a bunch of channels at once. This is helpful for, say, a monitor mix to see the entire monitor mix. Or if you would prefer, if you're back on the main layer and you've selected a channel, you can adjust the level to each bus send from here and the effects sends. The effects sends are down here. They're the same kind of idea. We could have our effects 1 be all of our drums, so that we send our drums all to a reverb, and maybe effects 2 is our guitars and keyboard reverb, and then effects 3 is our vocal reverb. We want to send those all to the same level to that. So that's how those work on getting things to the sends. But again, if you wanted to select just the keys, you can see the keys are sent to, or excuse me, keys vocal is sent to effect 3, and you can see that there even when you're on the main page. So 2 different ways to send things to effects, either on the individual channel level to all the sends, or all the channels to one particular send. 2 different ways to do that. Now over here on the right side, and the reason why I waited and came back to the sends tab, even though it's first, is that we can choose at what point in the channel path we send to that send. So let's say for our monitor mixes, we wanted to have no channel processing at all so that our vocalists, our instrumentalists on stage are not hearing any of our EQ or compression changes. Then we might say for our bus send number 1, we want that to go from our input processing, which would include the high pass filter, or pre-EQ. When we tap it, we can see that it changes down here at the very bottom. That changes where in the channel path that signal is being tapped to go to that send. So pre-EQ means after compression, but before the EQ. Post-EQ means after the EQ as well as all the dynamics. There's pre-fader and post-fader and a subgroup. So subgroup doesn't have any other fader controls. It's just grouping all of it together based on what the channel fader is. Pre-fader says I'm independent of the channel fader, and post-fader says whatever channel fader movements you make are also going to be reflected in this aux send. So for monitor mixes, probably not a good idea to do post-fader most of the time. I would usually use pre-fader, post-EQ, pre-EQ, or input channel processing. Whichever one you want to do is up to you. You've got to figure out what exactly you want them to hear in that aux send. So good stuff to know there. Now that we understand what that is, you'll notice that on the effects sends, you'll see that effects 1, 2, 3, and 4 are set up post fader, and that's what we want. We want the relationship of the dry signal going to the main bus and the wet signal coming back from the reverb to have the same relationship whether or not we turn that fader up and down. So we want to keep our effects sends as post fader. Now, if we go back and we go to our Effects tab, we can see what effects processors are loaded in Effects 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can hit Edit on here and choose which effect we have. Most of the effects down here on the left side are reverbs and delays. As we get over here, there's different modulation effects like flanger and chorus, rotary speaker, and tremolo. There's a sub-octaver, which could be a lot of fun or get you in a lot of trouble. And let's see, down here we've got some graphic EQ, not necessarily my favorite, but their true EQ is a little bit better. We've got the de-esser, which again, if we wanted to load this up and use it as an insert, we could do that. There's some other fun EQs, a wave designer, and then we get into some compressors as well. So if you're setting it up for mostly effects, I would stay down here on the left side. And there's a lot of videos out there covering these types of effects processors. They're the same ones that are in the Behringer X32, which there are a ton of videos out there on. So if you want to dive deeper in there, you can check those out. But we basically can load our parameters or load our unit here. And then when we tap on it, we can see finer control of each of these parameters. So we can tap that there and then adjust it here. The pre-delay, the decay time, all of those things are adjustable by tapping it and then adjusting here. Or if we wanted a different unit, let's go to this one. We can slide these up and down to get to those parameters. Sometimes there are 2 pages or different parameters you can get to. The 1 and 2 up here in the top right corner can get you to those if you want to get to some more advanced parameters. And that's how that works. We could also label our effects returns. You can see them show up here in green. So if we go back to how we label inputs under our setup and layout page, we come back down here to the green effects returns. We could call this drum verb if we wanted, vox verb, things like that, so that we can keep it straight. And again, labels are our friend. There's a couple different places that we can turn stuff up and down going to our effects. We can do it on the channel fader itself. So let's say we're on effects 3 for our vocals. We might turn this so that these are all at the same level. This fader now is the master going to the reverb. We could tuck this back a little bit if we want to have a little bit more fine control on the reverb return here. Usually a good starting place is around -12 for pulling that back and tucking it back and making it a little bit more musical reverb addition. That just tends to work. Your mileage might vary. You might need more reverb. You might need less, depending on how reverberant the space is that you're in. If you want a good starting place for where I start with EQ, compression, and effects on all the different instruments that you're likely to find at church, I've put together an ebook and a physical copy of the Live Mixing Field Guide. You can find information on how to buy it at the link below. In the next video, I'm going to walk you through building a mix on this little mixer. Should be a good time. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, please do so. Mash that thumbs up, it really helps the algorithm, and leave a comment if you like. And whatever you want to see on this little mixer, let me know soon so that I can make that and get it for you. As always, remember, it's all about the low end, avoid the sound tech solo, and nobody leaves church humming the kick drum. We'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.